Bambara, the Egyptian, were of a world which had primal matter, like a primeval soup, just as we modern physicists today believe, and a latent consciousness which grew to flowering, producing some extraordinary spirit which we call God, who then reconstituted the elements and divided them and set the universe into a certain direction, establishing certain principles. Something so advanced, so complex, so subtle. These are not simple people. And it must have taken hundreds and hundreds of years for them to arrive at that kind of highly complex knowledge. So even though it was as to use a phrase from one of the manuscripts of Benga translated, even though it was the morning of time, it was something far in advance of what many of us think and feel today. Something extraordinary had come upon the world, and it was to leave its mark on so many people. When the Egyptians struck 110 cities in Asia, they brought these things too into Asia. They brought these things through their invasion of the Greeks. Things were brought up into Europe. Look at our day. We take our day for granted. The 24-hour day is African. The second of time is African. The second of arc is African. Many of our volumes and weights and measures. And you look at the year, 365 and a quarter day year. That was not for granted. There's no street. To get that, you'd have to have accurate mathematics. The Sumerians or Babylonians or Mesopotamians, as they call them, did not have a 365 and a quarter day year. Yet they say how they influenced the Egyptian. They even tried to bring Egyptian chronology down into a certain date to fit with Sumerian chronology, even though it was shown very clearly by Kugler and others that the latest carbon date, the earliest carbon date for Sumerian civilization is hundreds of years after the Egyptian. They're not interested in the precision. No, it has to fit. Because since the Africans could not have created a place in Africa, we have to find some other people who must have made this thing possible. And so, how could you compare Sumer with Egypt? Ur, Lagash, and those places, those were city-states. They did not have the centralized network, the empire that the Egyptians created. And look at their writing system, the cuneiform tablets, the merchant bills and notes. They did not have the great literature of the Egyptians. Where is their literature compared to the literature of the Egyptians? The thousands of things that we have found even today in spite of the devastation. And look at their architecture. Who could compare the architecture of the Egyptians with the Sumerians? We cannot even reconstruct the Mesopotamian temple when the Egyptian works stand immortal upon the face of the earth. When the Sphinx, when the Great Pyramid was finished and it had its polished limestone casing, they say it was like a star over the earth. You could stand for hundreds of miles and see it shining. What is there in Sumer and in Babylon like that? They say the stone that was involved in the building of the Great Pyramid could build 30 Empire State Buildings. If you were to cut it into 1-foot cubes, it would encircle 2/3 of the belly of this planet. What are they talking about? And you look at all these things, you look at the medical documents you find in those Edwin Smith papyri, helminthiasis, ophthalmology, gynecology, pregnancy diagnosis, many things, studies of the pulse, studies in diagnostic percussion, fractures of the clavicle, dislocation in mandible. Word for word, Hippocrates takes out the fractures of the clavicle and dislocation in the mandible and puts it in his work. And he's the father of medicine, appearing long after in Hotep. He never called himself, give it the Jew to the Greeks. They did not make those claims. It's later people made those claims. Later people who said that they were the first, and they never said so. They never said so. The Greeks showed respect respect. Imhotep, the great black multi-genius, was worshipped as a god among the Europeans just as among the Africans. But so much had passed, and there was these assumptions. And it was, as Bernal points out in Black Athena, it was not until the early 19th century that there was a determined, sustained attempt, beginning with the Germans, to set this thing up on its head. The Negro does not belong to the civilized world. The Negro has a small brain. That went on for a while until they started examining brains, and they found that the South African bushman had a larger brain, so they dropped that one. Well, it isn't the size of the brain, it's the convolutions in the brain. And then they would take prisoners or people suffering from some disease in the hospitals and examine their brains and compare them with European brains. As Diop said, when I die, you should compare the convolutions in my brain. And now we have come to a point where you have all of this liberal story. Ah, yes, okay, forget that. That was a mistake. We were very prejudiced. We were racist. We admit it, so forth. Okay, fine, you're equal. And then when you try to prove through history you're equal, why are you making such a fuss? Haven't we given you enough? Why are you trying to claim our thing? See, it's very important to understand that. And Pythagoras brought the Pythagorean theorem out of Egypt. We have found earlier evidence of that. And as Newton said, Isaac Newton said that apart from their concept of the atom, they had a heliocentric theory of the solar system. They believed the sun was the center and the other bodies revolved around that. That was not known then in Europe. It was not accepted in Europe. And they also had theories about gravity. He said it was clear in the harmony of the spheres which the Pythagoreans brought up from Egypt that they saw the relationship between bodies in terms of gravitation and attraction, etc. All of these things were prefigured in early Egypt. But because it was so important in the world, because its impact was so great, and because it had affected European civilization, it had to be pushed aside. But now, we will not allow that anymore. We just have to be very careful, and this is something that happens in all movements, not to claim that everything is black. That is not necessary. The contributions of the black to the world are so great in terms of what we know now that it is not necessary to claim things that are not necessarily true. In the field of medicine, for example, they have found incredible things. They have found vaccines among Africans long before Edwin Jenner. They found the smallpox vaccine had been brought to this country by Onesimus, a slave of Cotton Mather. They found that the Africans were using aspirin long before the Western nations, that the Bantu were using Salix capensis, which yields salicylic acid, the main active ingredient in aspirin. They found the Africans had made breakthroughs in eye cataract surgery in the 13th century. Africans were performing eye cataract surgery in the Empire of Mali, in the city of Djenné. Nobody in the world was performing eye cataract surgery at the time. And there were certain surgeries in Africa which taught surgeries which had a profound effect on surgery in Europe. In the 1870s, whenever the caesarean operation was performed, the caesarean section was performed in women, the woman invariably died in Europe. Because of the British Empire, the British learned that Africans were performing the caesarean successfully. A team under Dr. Felkin went out to East Africa among the Banyoro surgeons to study how they were performing this operation. They noted, please note, that the Africans had developed their own anesthetics and their own antiseptics. Antiseptics had only been introduced in an European operating theater by Lister 2 years earlier than the witness of this operation. Many doctors in Europe did not know, as late as the